to?
It is now recording.
Okay, thank you. Professor Campbell?
Okay, thank you, Madam. How do you do? Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome. Usually we wait to get people to come to the meeting on time, but because we are operating on the constraints of time, we want to start right away, and we think some people will join us. So on behalf of the Africa Initiative of Syracuse University, I would like to welcome you all to this event to discuss the Biden-Harris administration and what it means for Africa and Africans. I am one of the co-chairs of the Africa Initiative of Syracuse University. The Africa Initiative of Syracuse University is a campus-wide project housed in the Department of African American Studies within the College of Arts and Sciences. Its purpose is to focus on Africa as an important site of knowledge by highlighting teaching, research, and publication work by Syracuse University scholars in the arts, humanities, social and natural sciences, mathematics, engineering, and others. The initiative aims to revitalize interest in Africa, which has been on the wane in the many institutions of higher learning since the end of the Cold War. And it's only been revived now in the context of the war on terror. And some of you know what the last president said about Africans, using what academics call failed states. The president gave his own stamp on that academic formulation. In this respect, it's important to note that Syracuse University once had a vibrant African studies program, although notable resources accumulated during existence, such as the East African collection at the Bird Library, remain. Moving forward from this history, the Africa Initiative is building upon the previous experience while charting new directions, including offering a significant pool of experts specializing in various aspects of this diverse and richly endowed continent. The Africa Initiative's presence in the Department of African American Studies reinforces a critical site where most academic work on Africa at Syracuse University is done, and where the continent and the Caribbean are perceived as concomitant parts of the department's Pan-African vision. In bringing together Syracuse University scholars from various disciplines, the Africa Initiative not only promotes interdisciplinary exchange, but also reinforces the university's ongoing effort to diversify and internationalize the educational experience of our students. As such, the initiative places great emphasis on study abroad programs in Africa, as well as the provision of financial resources to give students exposure to that continent. By providing an alternative vision and platform for constructive discourse on Africa and African peoples, the African Initiative is helping alter the dominant perception of Africa as a continent ridden with perpetual crises and despair. This event is our second event for the semester. Last week, we had a very, very important event on 10 years after the Egyptian and Tunisian revolution. This is the third discussion that the Syracuse University African Initiative is having with reference to a new incoming administration. In 2001, when George Bush came into power, the African Initiative had a discussion on the relations between the United States of America and the Congo. And at that point, the African Initiative was calling on the administration to pay attention to 40 years after the killing of Patrice Lumumba. When the Obama administration came into power, the African Initiative had a major symposium focusing on health, environment, education, and militarism. The African Initiative then warned the Obama administration that it should not be involved in the militarization of Africa. Of course, it was ignored. The African Initiative later had a symposium on Libya and the destruction of Libya. We're going to follow up this year with another such discussion. The African Initiative held discussions, and we had discussions on Chinua Achebe. We produced a book on Chinua Achebe, on Michel Mugo, and these are still works that that work is still being published. So today we anticipate that we will have a vigorous discussion on the Biden administration in Africa. And thank you all for coming. And I want to thank especially our esteemed speakers from all parts of the world who are participating in this discussion today. Thank you. I'll now hand it over to another board member of the African Initiative, Professor Roy Campbell.
Good morning. As the speakers make their presentations, you can put your questions or comments in the chat box. At the end of the 5 speakers, then we will open the floor for questions and discussion. Okay, I'd like to start by introducing our first speaker, our first presenter. Dr. Samar Al-Bulushi is an assistant professor in the Department of Anthropology at University of California, Irvine. Her research is broadly concerned with surveillance, militarism, and policing in the context of the so-called War on Terror in East Africa. She is a contributing editor at Africa is a Country, and her work has appeared in public outlets such as The Guardian, Al Jazeera, Intercepted, Jacobin, Pambazuka, and Africa is a Country. So I welcome Dr. Al-Bulushi to make her presentation. And she will be speaking for about 10 minutes.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Professor Roy Campbell. And thank you to the organizers, to Jordan Thomas and to Mwalimu Horace Campbell for the invitation. It is an honor to join all of you today. And I very much look forward to being in dialogue with my fellow distinguished co-panelists. Before I begin, I just wanted to ask if it's possible for me to show a few slides, if you can give me the ability to share my screen.
Jordan, can you give her permission?
Great.
Yes, in the process.
I should be able to do it now. Wonderful. Okay. All right, you can all see the screen, right? Perfect. So I have been tasked with providing a broad picture of the so-called War on Terror and what it has meant for the African continent. This is not something that is easily done in 10 minutes. I will do my best. And I know that there is a lot of shared knowledge among all of you here today, so I look forward to learning from you as well. In the past 20 years, the African continent has seen the largest relative rise in military spending of any region in the world. In general, we are witnessing a growing investment in war and policing alongside a rise in extrajudicial killings, disappearances, and the criminalization of dissent. These dynamics are closely connected to the War on Terror and to the rise of the US Africa Command. Now, as many of us know, the mainstream media after 9/11 focused primarily on the Middle East. But in fact, the Bush administration had been for some time thinking about the strategic significance of the African continent, especially for securing US oil supplies. And so these were some of the conversations that were contributing to the decision to set up AFRICOM, which is now one of 11 combatant commands of the Department of Defense, currently headquartered in Germany. AFRICOM was authorized in 2006 and became fully operational in 2008. We have a growing understanding of what AFRICOM looks like in practice. It consists of a vast network of military bases scattered across the continent. So from Mali and Niger to Kenya and Djibouti, we've been presented with maps of logistics hubs, of forward operating sites, and of cooperative security locations. These visual representations are powerful resources for activists because each dot on the map helps us conceptualize AFRICOM as a geopolitical assemblage whose everyday functioning across time and space facilitates militarism and war on a global scale. But I want to suggest that there are limits to this kind of knowledge. I believe that an over-reliance on maps comes with risks. First, it paints a picture of a seemingly coherent imperial machine without attention to the materiality of its working. So what do these forms of cooperation look like on a day-to-day basis? How are agreements reached? We need to know these kinds of details in order to better be able to be prepared to push back and to resist. Secondly, these maps homogenize and flatten people and places, obscuring historical specificity. So the effect is that Africans themselves become peripheral, if not invisible. If the only image of AFRICOM is of dots on a map, then we come to understand the US military's violence to unfold only in pockets of territory, seemingly populated simply by armed militants and not by human beings who are going about their daily lives. So I believe it's incumbent upon us to be discerning about the information that we receive, even if on a superficial level it appears to align with our political commitments, but especially because the bulk of information that comes out about AFRICOM comes from the US military itself. I'm going to turn now to a discussion of East Africa and the Horn, which has been the focus of my research. So the Horn is the site of growing competition between the US, China, and Russia, with Turkey and the Gulf states playing increasingly significant roles. Between the expanding archipelago of military bases to the provision of weapons and military training, to the ongoing wars in Yemen and Somalia, competing players are scrambling for influence. While the US media gave us the impression last year that the US would be drawing down its military presence in Africa, this is misleading for at least two reasons. One, because of the growing strategic significance of this particular region, and two, because troops have been shuffled around within the continent. So in the case of the Horn, they've been moved out of Somalia and redistributed to Djibouti and to Kenya. So what can we expect from the Biden administration? Firstly, I want to emphasize the continued significance of race for US policy towards Africa. We cannot be fooled by the presence of Black faces in high places, whether it is Lloyd Austin as Secretary of Defense, Kamala Harris as Vice President, or Linda Thomas Greenfield as US Ambassador to the United Nations. Secondly, we should not be fooled by seemingly innocent language and respectability politics. And we certainly should not be fooled by the co-optation of historical figures and popular struggle. And I want to show you a slide here. Some of you may have caught this. It very briefly appeared on social media in June of last year in the aftermath of the George Floyd killing, when AFRICOM sought to seize upon all of our emotions and invoke the legacy and history of Dr. Martin Luther King. US policy towards Africa is rarely articulated or understood explicitly in the language of race. The language of good governance and state failure appears to be free of racial tropes, but ultimately, of course, has racialized connotations. These concepts are often conveyed in the form of graphs and charts and maps that paint certain parts of the world as exceptional and therefore in need of intervention. And Somalia is a perfect example here. In November of 2001, Assistant Secretary of State for African Affairs, Susan Rice, referred to Somalia as an ungoverned, lawless, radicalized, heavily armed country. These portrayals of Somalia were not new. We saw similar language, of course, employed in the 1990s when the US intervened then, and in the Hollywood portrayal of this intervention in the film Black Hawk Down. But the re-scripting of Somalia as lawless and ungoverned in the early 2000s contributed to a call to action. Importantly, however, while the Bush administration was vocal about the need to intervene, it had no intention of placing US troops on the ground. Instead, it invoked the language of partnership and sought to garner support from allies who would be ready to deploy their own troops to the front lines. And this, of course, was deliberate. The dispersal of violent authority to partner states effectively functions to make US participation less visible and thereby less traceable, with clear implications for accountability efforts. Ethiopia was the first to step up as a so-called partner with US supplied aerial reconnaissance and satellite surveillance. Ethiopia invaded Somalia in December of 2006. The United Nations not only failed to condemn the invasion, but effectively encouraged it when it asked the Ethiopian troops to remain in place until a quote unquote peacekeeping operation could be set up. So we now have what is now known as AMISOM, the African Union Mission in Somalia, that was set up in early 2007. And I want to emphasize here how the language of peacekeeping has served as a cover for what has now been a 13-year-long military occupation of Somalia. It began as a small deployment of roughly 1,600 troops and gradually transformed into a number that exceeded 22,000. While AMISOM's initial rules of engagement permitted the use of force only when necessary, it gradually assumed an offensive role and has become engaged in counterinsurgency and counterterror operations. Meanwhile, AMISOM's donors, including the US and the European Union, have been able to offset the expense and public scrutiny of maintaining their own troops in Somalia by relying both on private contractors and African forces. Kenya is another example of a key partner state that has become entangled in this war. US troops have operated from a base in northeastern Kenya in Manda Bay since 2003. They began launching drone strikes in Somalia in 2007. And in 2011, Kenya sent its own troops across the border into Somalia. They too were incorporated into AMISOM, and the salaries of these troops are paid for by European and American donors, which means that there's very little incentive for the troop contributing states to leave, because the monthly salaries of the troops vastly exceeds what they earn back home. Moreover, it is now widely documented that senior officials in the Kenyan military have partnered with and profited handsomely from Al-Shabaab's cross-border trade in charcoal and sugar. So what we have is a self-perpetuating economy of violence and insecurity that is unlikely to end anytime soon, particularly now that Kenya has assumed a seat at the UN Security Council, where it can shape international perceptions of what is taking place in Somalia. Oh, sorry, I forgot to show you those slides. This is a publication of the Kenyan military that shares its own version of events. Okay, looking ahead, the last few years have seen a dramatic rise in the use of drone strikes. We can see here in this graph the extent to which they rose exponentially in the last few years. While the Biden administration will strive to paint a different image of itself, we can expect drone strikes, bombings, and targeted assassinations to continue. And this part is really important. In the past several weeks, since Biden assumed office, there have been reports of at least 2 separate drone strikes in Somalia, but AFRICOM has denied responsibility, and this has gone completely unreported in the US press. Now, if we are to take the US government at its word that it is not responsible for these 2 recent strikes, then I believe we need to allow for the possibility that Kenya and Ethiopia will be playing more significant roles in this regard. Both of their militaries have already been conducting targeted operations against Al-Shabaab, and in my assessment, this demands that we devote more attention to the African military and security assemblages that sustain the US imperial formation. In summary, I argue that AFRICOM is one key instrument of militarized power that has rightly garnered scrutiny, but it is situated within and very much reliant upon regional security infrastructures that are largely overlooked. In addition to AMISOM, the example of Kenya, in addition to what I've already shared with you, we also see within Kenya that US and UK trained police forces like the Anti-Terror Police Unit and this picture here of the Rapid Response Team are responsible for disappearances and extrajudicial killings. So the war on terror in Africa is as much a form of police action as it is military bombardment, unfolding not only on officially declared battlefields, but equally in seemingly peaceful urban centers. I want to conclude by emphasizing that activists in Kenya have been documenting and protesting counter-terror abuses for years, but for a variety of reasons, their activism is often overlooked or not legible to us here in the United States. And I hope we have an opportunity to discuss what openings exist to build solidarity on these issues. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Al-Bulushi. I remind you to put your questions or comments in the chat box. We will have a discussion after all the speakers have made their presentations. Our next speaker will be Julialynne Walker. Julialynne is a chair of the Pan-African Congress North America delegation from Columbus, Ohio, and she's had over 30 years of experience in working with movements for social change, beginning with the civil rights movement in the United States and continuing with African liberation struggles. And she's still engaged in consolidating the Pan-African movement as a technical expert for the Africa Union Diaspora experts meeting in Johannesburg, South Africa. She is a recipient of the ONI Award for the International Congress of Black Women, 2013, the Service Award for the International Congress of Black Women, 2016, and the Pan-African Award for the Federation of African Organizations of Ohio in 2015. So I pass it on to Julialynne Walker to make her presentation.
Thank you very much, Professor Roy Campbell. And is everyone on mute? I'm not sure why I'm picking up, but I'm not. All right, let me just go ahead. First of all, coming out of my African experience, all protocol observed, but I'm very pleased to be here this afternoon, and I'm looking forward to the discussion that we will have afterwards. So, Biden administration in Africa, we charge genocide. The crime of government against the Negro people is a paper accusing the United States government of genocide based on the UN Genocide Convention and presented to the United Nations in Paris in December 1951. It followed the 1946 statement by the National Negro Congress submitted to the Secretary General and the 1947 appeal from the NAACP presented by Dr. W.E.B. Du Bois. From the inception of the world's foremost international body, the people of African descent resident in North America have sought justice for our conditions at the hands of successive governments of the United States. And in 2021, we continue to charge genocide. In June 2020, an international coalition of hundreds of organizations and individuals sent a communication to the United Nations Human Rights Council, urging them to convene a commission of inquiry to investigate racism and racist police violence in the United States. Although the UN declined the request, it tasked the UN High Commission on Human Rights with preparing a report on racism. Following the UN's decision not to convene a commission of inquiry, the National Conference of Black Lawyers, the International Association of Democratic Lawyers, and the National Lawyers Guild joined forces to establish a commission of inquiry of experts from around the world to investigate racist, systemic, widespread, and grave police violence against people of African descent in the United States. This commission has recently concluded, after hearing from victims, direct and indirect, of this violence, and will shortly submit its report to the United States. This is an example of African Americans and their allies understanding that our expectations should be expressed, and should those expectations fall on deaf ears, then we should be prepared to act. And this is where we are with the Biden administration. One would have to be a QAnon supporter not to understand the progressive role of Black women in the election of the current administration. And many organizations, progressive and otherwise, are beginning to condemn what is perceived to be a shortchanging of that debt. It is and isn't about the numbers. Yes, we want to see our faces, but more importantly, we want to see the values and especially the policies that will ensure significant changes in the health and welfare of people of African descent in the United States. As was documented in the 1946 and 1951 petitions, we continue to experience unequal enjoyment of all human rights, economic, social, cultural, civil, and political, including the right to development and the protection of national and international legal frameworks. Last June was the culmination of a UN process that was instigated at the behest of a group of African nations, an urgent debate into racism and police civil liberties violations against people of African descent in the US. Forums were held throughout the United States. At the conclusion, the UN Human Rights Chief affirmed the flagrant existence of such violations and called for a reparatory process that would involve financial and other recourse. She also urged other countries to make amends for centuries of violence and discrimination. As one of the outcomes of the World Conference Against Racism, Xenophobia, and other related intolerances in 2001, the International Decade for the People of African Descent was proclaimed for 2015 to 2024. It recognizes that people of African descent are a distinct group whose human rights must be promoted and protected. With over 200 million people who identify as being of African descent. And this is not just about the Americas, but about tens of millions of people who exist and live in countries around the world outside of the African continent. And so within this, there are three main areas of focus for the decade. Recognition, or the right to equality and non-discrimination and the access to justice. Development, or the right to decision-making regarding the fair distribution of benefits, and recognition that poverty is a result of social exclusion and not an individual determinant. And so while we should be celebrating the recent Commission of Inquiry as just one of a group of results for this decade, the reality is that with just 3 years to go, we are still informing people of its existence. We should still hold African people responsible for the continued existence of, what should we expect for the Biden administration for Africa? We should still hold African people responsible for the continued existence of autocratic and personalized political power, which has been legitimized very often by the legacy of liberation struggles, and has frequently produced cases of stayism, whereby leaders employ extra-constitutional and coercive means to retain power. Weak opposition parties, a focus on loyalty rather than issues, constrained civil society and media, privatized violence, politicized armies, and intrastate violence all remain issues of concern in too many countries. Post-independence elites have largely entrenched their own interests with control of the state and its resources becoming the primary purpose of political contestation. So we as a people, we should insist with respect to the Biden-Harris administration on recognition of the role of the US government in undermining the democratic process in Africa historically and in a contemporary sense through the direct assassination of leaders and the undermining of its economies or their economies. As there has been recent information regarding the assassination of Malcolm X, So we should call for bringing to light all that is known about the assassination of Patrice Lumumba and the role of the United States government and its agencies. We will continue to call for the acknowledgement of the role of the African Union and the AU roadmap for Libya, and forcibly condemn Western support for Morocco's attack on opposition civilians in the Western Sahara. We must insist that the United States under the Biden administration recognize Africa's right to freely negotiate control of its economies, especially in the areas of health, education, agriculture, and communication. And with respect to recent developments regarding regional free trade zones that promise effective collaborative relationships. We urge conditions for positive changes and for fostering human development in Africa with the promotion and retention of African scholars and entrepreneurs. And specifically, with respect to African Americans, Biden and his administration must sign on to the 3 components of the UN Decade for Formal Recognition within the US political arena: the right to equality and non-discrimination, the right to decision-making regarding the distribution of fair benefits, and recognition that poverty is a result of social exclusion based on systemic racism. We experienced the Obama administration and the effort to implement measures of change only to witness the rapid refutation of those changes by the last administration. Within less than 100 days, Joseph Biden has resorted to executive orders to return the country to some level close to where we were at the end of 2016. Is this the future of US politics, especially for people of African descent? COVID-19 has exposed a festering sore, where the narrative has changed from one of invincibility to one of utter vulnerability, where the rates of infection have been disproportionate for African Americans, primarily due to underlying conditions that exist as a result of economic conditions. And thus the mortality rates were disproportionate as well. Yet African descendants comprise the bulk of the healthcare and other essential workers, but lack access to a minimum wage that is a living wage for 90% of the continental United States. And the education system has revealed the fundamental flaws crucial to perform well as a student. Too many neighborhoods of people of color were exposed as islands lacking in any access to technology. Parents who had just lost or were in danger of losing their jobs were ill prepared to resolve issues with the educational system. And Black Lives Matter took to the streets day after day in defense of yet another brother who was just trying to live in these United States. We encourage, as the Pan-African Congress North America, Africans in the diaspora to be more involved in the development of Africa, in the emergence and consolidation of democratic practices across the continent. We would also be remiss today, for me, I would be remiss, to end without condemning the government of Nigeria for still insisting on a speedy resolution to the abduction of school children after 7 years of such abductions, even though we understand that these abductions they reflect the unrest and instability in general in the region, which needs to be addressed and resolved on an international basis. Yes, in 2021, we still charge genocide. Thank you.
Thank you, Julialynne. I'll remind people to put your comments and questions in the chat box. Our next speaker is Dr. Marcel Gitazoo, who currently serves as a contributing faculty in the PhD program of the School of Policy and Administration at Walden University, teaches in the Department of Africana Studies at the University of Albany, and is affiliated with the Institute for African Development at Cornell University. He is editor-in-chief of the International Journal of African Studies and editor of the Journal of African Foreign Affairs. He coordinates the International Consortium for Geopolitical Studies of the Sahel. His research publications focus on international security, the politics of water, and China's presence in Africa. So I will pass you on to Dr. Kittisou.
Thank you very much for introducing me. Can you hear me correctly, clearly?
Yes, we can hear you.
Okay. Yeah, thank you for inviting me to participate in this panel discussion about what Africans can expect from Biden-Harris administration. My immediate response is a lot. Because of the political alliances and composition of the coalition behind the new administration. But the expectations are not going to become reality by the natural order of things. We must work on it and we must fight for it. My discussion will focus on 3 areas. 1, how to make the United Nations system fair for Africa. 2, how can the new administration help improve the situation in the Sahel? And 3, what can or should can be done to make things happen? The UN system, I will begin with the UN system. The foundational values of the United Nations are equality and human rights. However, as the journal Jeune Afrique reported this February 2021, institutional racism is at the core of the administrative structures of the United Nations. Powerful nations have carved out their own turf. The Office of the Coordination of Humanitarian Action Affairs, OSHA, created in 1991, has been directed by the British Mark Lowcock since 2017. The 3 previous directors since 2007 were also British. No Africans hold a position among the 16 top officials, even though they constitute 23% of the staff. The French exercise their influence in the Department of Peacekeeping Operations. The Chinese control the Department of Economic and Social Affairs, and the Department of Political Affairs falls under the US influence. This division of labor determines the practice of recruitment, retention, and promotion, and that is not a favorable situation to recruit, retain, and promote Africans. The fact that 2 Africans were Secretary General, Boutros Ghali from 92 to 96, and Kofi Annan from 97 to 2006, that has not brought any change in the discriminatory practices that characterize the United Nations administrative structures and has prolonged the discrimination of people from Africa in the system. Africans' reaction. George Floyd was murdered by Minneapolis police on May 25th, 2020. The anger this murder created was palpable within the UN staff. In New York City headquarters, 70% of the positions were occupied by Westerners. Antonio Guterres, the Secretary General, circulated an internal memo asking the employees to abstain from showing support to Black Lives Matter. There was a pushback, a strong pushback And then there was an about face. On June 4th, the Secretary General recognized that the scourge of racism exists within the UN system and started a dialogue about racism in the United Nations system. On December 30th, 2020, the ambassadors and permanent representatives of African countries wrote a declaration titled United Against Racism and Racial Discrimination at the United Nations. Another declaration of January 4th, 2021 was addressed to the 193 state members, among which 20 accepted to co-sign the declaration. With the new US representative to the UN being an African American, this represents an opportunity to address and promote changes in the practice of racial discrimination against Africans in the UN system. African governments have long been accused of doing nothing about such situation. Now that they are speaking out, a serious dialogue can start. As one participant in a panel I participated in this week said, if you don't say I am, nobody will say you are. Peace and security in the Sahel, that is my second area. France's African policy is experiencing serious structural changes. For the French diplomatic staff, serving in Africa is not a career enhancer. However, for the French military personnel, serving in Africa is a career builder. According to a French political scientist, Rémi Carayol, in 3 decades, the French Ministry of Foreign Affairs lost 53% of its staff, mostly in Africa. The last 10 years, the African and Indian Ocean desk lost 40% of its staff. France's African policy has been militarized as a result and now relies more on the military than on diplomatic officers in the French policy making toward Africa. And the military preferring the strong man as partner are more concerned about winning the war than winning the peace. The short term rather than the long term. Negotiation is no longer part of the equation. Doctrines of past professionals in colonial pacification, such as Julialynne, who pacified Madagascar, and Marshal Thomas Bijou, who was instrumental in the conquest of Algeria. The doctrine of those military colonial officers are re-emerging. And one should remember that Jean-Yves Le Drian, the current French Foreign Affairs Minister, was Minister of Defense under the previous administration of François Hollande. The warning of the US President Franklin Delano Roosevelt to Churchill and de Gaulle during World War II at the conference of 1943 in Casablanca is worth remembering. I quote, "I have tried to make clear to Winston," that is Winston Churchill, "and others, including Charles de Gaulle, that while we are their allies and in to victory by their side, they must never get the idea that we are in just to help them hang on to the archaic medieval empire ideas, he told his son Elliot. This principle should guide the security cooperation between the Biden-Harris administration and Emmanuel Macron in the Sahel. What can be expected from the Biden-Harris administration in that regard? Because of France's economic and military limitations, France has to work with local government. Hence, the creation of the G5 Sahel Joint Force in 2014 that include Burkina Faso, Mali, Mauritania, Niger, and Chad, and also with Western allies, including the US. The situation in the Sahel is getting worse. Coastal countries are now being affected. There is no way with 4,000 troops of the Operation Barkhane and 5,000 troops from the GS Sahel, the Joint Force, there is no way with those forces, even combined, France can control an area of 5 million square kilometers. President Macron was said to be prepared to withdraw French troops. Then, a few days ago, changed his mind. One can speculate that he expects more cooperation from the new US administration, given that the US has rejoined the Paris Accord and is working with France to revive the Iran nuclear agreement in expectation of extending that cooperation to other domains, included in Africa, is possible. What can we expect a continuation? A greater involvement of the US means that France will likely become a junior partner in the fight against the jihadists in the Sahel. It also means a more comprehensive approach, working with both Francophone and Anglophone countries, other Western countries, and possibly with NATO, and that will make the approach to the jihadists in the Sahel more comprehensive, and also make France's influence less obvious than it is now. And also, there is an aspect that could be addressed by a more comprehensive approach to the jihadists in the Sahel. There is currently a tacit understanding between France and its African partners that could be broken. As African countries provide military support to France's military operations, they are also allowed, as in return, to do whatever they want within their borders. A greater US involvement is likely to bring and create a space for democratic practices in the region. And finally, things will not happen by their own. There were intense organization and mobilization to end apartheid in South Africa. The same applied to debt cancellation campaign before Jubilee 2000, Blood Diamond, and the Kimberley process, the Save Darfur campaign. We should understand that any US administration is under the pressure of competing demand. If you don't say I am, nobody will say you are. The current Biden-Harris administration offer an opportunity for advocacy on behalf of Africa and people of African descent. In recent past, I participated in a network of 50 NGOs based in Washington, D.C., who work partially or entirely on African issues. It was known as Advocacy Network for Africa, or ADNA, in Washington, D.C. And that was a powerful vehicle for advocating on behalf of Africa and people of African descent. Such coalitions need to remain active or created in the current and work with the current administration to improve people to improve a lot of people in Africa and people of African descent. So I will stop here, and I look forward to questions and other contributions to my presentation.
Thank you, Dr. Kittisou. Our final speaker, we had another speaker, but from Ghana, but he's unable to get on because he's having internet connections. So our final speaker will be Professor Cheryl Hendricks, who is the Executive Director of the Africa Institute of South Africa within the Human Science Research Council. Prior to this, she was a professor and head of a department in politics and international studies at the University of Johannesburg in South Africa. And she was previously at the Institute for Security Studies, first as program head for the Southern Africa Human Security Program, and then as a senior research fellow in the Conflict Management and Peacebuilding Division. She has published widely on women, peace and security, African politics, South African foreign policy, regional security architectures, and engages in a range of policymakers, academic researchers, and civil society on these issues. Professor Hendricks.
Thank you, Chair. My pleasure to be here with the Africa Initiative and with my fellow panelists and participants here today. I am tasked to make some brief remarks on the directions that the USA could take with Africa to strengthen their relations. I think that the panelists already have given us good ground for discussion. I am going to confine my remarks to 3 areas. The idea that America is back and that we can now restore more harmonious diplomatic relations, and that it can reassume global leadership, especially in the quest for democratization. Secondly, the current continental context and the needs that emerge from this. And thirdly, then a focus on where and how America can best strengthen relations with Africa. As we all know, there's a strong relationship between domestic and foreign policy, and America has once again demonstrated this to us. The 4 years of Trump's rule created not only deep rifts within American society, but also between it and the rest of the world. The racial, class, and ideological divides all resurfaced because of the narrow ethno-nationalist politics that was being pursued. There was a distinct white supremacist logic underlying Trump's engagements. Africa was dismissed in rather undiplomatic ways. And we all know the language of shithole countries, quote unquote, noticed only in as far as it presented a source of threat for the import of violent extremism, or through the lens of competition with China, or how it could use African countries to try and normalize Israel's relations, and obviously also for expanding access to trade and natural resources. A key part of Trump's prosperity program for Africa was aimed at, and I'm quoting, countering China's commercial security and political influence. Trump's rule exposed the underbelly of American society, the continued racism, lack of respect for democratic principles, as highlighted by the storming of the Capitol, the fragmentation of American society, and its bullish mentality internationally. You cannot simply put that genie back in a bottle and erase it from our memories. Those weaknesses were seen globally, and they will alter the way in which America is perceived and how we relate to it, as opposed to merely how it relates to us. America's influence was already waning before Trump and continued to decline during his reign, primarily because there were a number of new international actors to contend with. Trump's administration sought to work with countries bilaterally, undermining our multilateral institutions and agreements, in that way using the classic tactic of divide and rule to have an advantage. And American interaction with us seemed to be more punitive than constructive, reducing aid to Ethiopia because it dared to decide to build a dam on its own, forcing Sudan to pay compensation because of Al-Qaeda's attacks before it would take it off the terrorist list, and to force Sudan also to acknowledge friendly relations with Israel. So yes, we have all breathed a sigh of relief with the assumption of power of President Joe Biden. He says he will put an end to that chapter of America's history to reunite the nation, reinstill America's core values and rebuild its alliances. And his rallying phrase is America is back. But here in Africa, we cannot help but ask which America and back where? His administration has a big task ahead of themselves. It's not a matter of simply pressing the reset button and or of cosmetic changes. The world has not been sitting here waiting for a new president or regime or administration in America. It has moved on despite it. Therefore, this will not be the same America we knew in the 1990s or when President Barack assumed power in 2009. It is weaker and fractured on many dimensions, and it will not find the same world or Africa either here. And so when it engages, it has to think through a new approach. It will find that there's been a global rise in conservatism, a decline in the quality of our democracies, a rise in hybrid democracies, a rise in violent extremism in Africa, a world in which the COVID-19 pandemic has taken us back into the logger mentalities and increased economic hardship, a world where climate change is accelerating far faster than predicted, a world where military might cannot fight against the key threats facing us: cybersecurity, energy insecurity, water and food shortages, health insecurity, poverty, and unemployment. Where we, in short, we find countries being more inward-looking, ethnocentric, autocratic at precisely the time when we need stronger global governance, a common sense of purpose, and more solidarity. And when we listen to Biden's speeches, they seem to recognize this. America may want to assume leadership, but it is itself wrapped by its internal challenges and will therefore find it hard to exert the kind of leadership needed. And there are many more players, so leadership is not uncontested. For the new scramble for Africa has long since commenced. America will have to work hard to restore trust and credibility, and will have to work more collaboratively, even with those that it has and is framing as its enemies, especially since they are not necessarily Africa's enemies. And Africa has the choice of collaborating with a number of different actors and will and should use that opportunity to its own advantage. It will hopefully not be caught up again in big power hegemonic rivalries. In trying to restore relations, America has already directed its message of "I am back" primarily at Europe and its transatlantic alliance. Africa has not been and will not be a priority for the US. And in Africa, we may not want to celebrate America being back too quickly if it's the same one that in its quest to bring democracy to everybody caused such destabilization that we continue to live with the ramifications thereof. And I think here particularly of Libya. So when America says it's back, in Africa, we want to be clear on the what, the where, and the how thereof. It was heartening to see that Biden took the time to address the African Union virtually on the 5th of February. That is already sending a strong willingness to reach out to rebuild relations with the continent and to show a level of respect. He noted that his administration was opting for, and I'm quoting, a future committed to investing in democratic institutions and promoting the human rights of all people, women and girls, LGBTQI individuals, people with disabilities, and people of every ethnic background, along with trade and investment and peace and security. The US has had a diplomatic mission at the African Union since 2006. It has defined its partnership as based on peace and security, democracy and governance, economic growth, trade and investment, and opportunity and development. And in this sense, I think there will be a continuity in the focus areas of the different administrations. It's just a matter of emphasis. Biden has already indicated that his would be a focus on democratization and inclusivity. He would have to start in the US and then at the global governance institutions, which are, as we all know, in need of democratic reform, and perhaps also deal with the racism in Europe in this quest. So he will be very busy. But let me turn to Africa. Here we see a changing conflict context, shifts in geopolitical power, and a weakening of our intergovernmental institutions. As has been the case elsewhere, we see a definite spread of violent extremism. It is now in all our regions as ISIS sets up its provinces, quote unquote. Obviously, it is spreading. If it is spreading, then the methods we are using to counter it needs to be questioned. Methods that have been imported and where billions are being spent on military reinforcements, even when the conditions that enable the spread of extremism are well known. And they relate to marginalization and exclusion, underdevelopment, porous borders, brutality of the security sector responses, at the same time as there is an inadequate provision of security, hinterlands that have become the source of alternative forms of governance and propagation of statehood, where if we're not careful, alternative social contracts are being forged through violence, always though in search of a better life, real or imagined. And northern Mozambique is the latest casualty, but there will be more to come. If we are unable to provide the necessary human security, faced with a growing populations and food and water and energy scarcity, poverty and unemployment, the writing is on the wall for us to experience more and more violence. We are also seeing more and more local level conflicts emerge. And I think of the report by the IPSS released 2 years ago, in which they counted, I think, 62 local level conflicts being induced by fights over things like water and land, etc., related to climate change. We also still have interstate conflicts as the tensions over the Grand Ethiopian Renaissance Dam testifies. Fights over access to water will become more frequent and point to the need for us to revisit old treaties and agreements and to revive and or repurpose the mechanisms that were set up to deal with the issue, with this particular issue. For example, the Lake Chad Basin, which was repurposed to deal with violent extremism. The tensions over the construction of GERD indicate the need for this to be instituted sooner rather than later. Staying in the Horn of Africa, we saw the recent conflict in the Tigray region, and although there is ostensibly a return to law and order, the threat of a shift to guerrilla warfare cannot be discounted in an already fragile region. We are using band-aid strategies in Ethiopia, as we keep doing, for example, for Somalia, for DRC, Sudan, and many other conflict countries in Africa. The kind of conflict management strategies that we are employing do not lead to sustainable peace. To have sustainable peace, we need to rethink state building, forms of representation, social contracts, and with the provision of human security. It is not simply saying we must have democracy. We cannot keep having governments of national unity that keep adding layers and layers of diverse actors, many of them non-democratic, that we expect to then convert to becoming democrats into our governments. Many of these actors are for the most part simply intent on eating from the state's trough rather than providing inclusive governance in which we all prosper, and then we wonder why the states remain dysfunctional and why peace agreements do not hold. Other countries are racked by the lack of service delivery, corruption, one party or one leader, dominant states, and the like. What COVID-19 did was lay bare the vulnerabilities of our states, not just inadequate healthcare that we here have known for decades, but inadequate education, inadequate reform of our security sector, inadequate parliamentary oversight, inadequate social protection, and the like. But importantly, it also showed resilience because people have actually been surviving without the state support for decades. And it showed ingenuity in the many initiatives where people try to innovate to deal with a pandemic. It also showed that Africans working together, what Africans working together could do, because Africans now saw the African Union suddenly become an important source of information and coordination, and now again for access to vaccines. The African Union seemed to do well in its handling of this pandemic, and we hope to see more of such kinds of coordinated responses going forward. As you well know, Africa has Agenda 2063, of which silencing the guns by 2020 and the implementation of the African Continental Free Trade Agreement are key parts of this roadmap for development. So any US policy towards Africa should be informed, firstly, by this agenda. The guns have not been silenced, and the AFCTA is still at the beginning of its implementation. The plan for silencing the guns by 2020 was last month deferred to 2030 with no serious evaluation of its implementation. And there's a lot that needs to be done to ensure the success of the African Continental Free Trade Agreement so that it does not suffer from the same fate as the Lagos Plan of Action, for example. Here I'm thinking of the creation of enabling environments for free trade, regulatory frameworks, infrastructure, investment, etc. And support from the international community will be key here, especially not to undermine the implementation of the AFCTA. The US has engaged us on defense and security, largely, as we have heard, through AFRICOM. There are about, I think, 6,000 to 7,000 troops on the continent in around 29 bases, mostly scattered in North Africa, Sahel, West Africa, and the Horn. Special forces are engaged in countering violent extremism in Somalia and Niger. The US has provided support to the African Union Commission's Peace Support Operations Division and support for AMISOM. It has supported many African countries to strengthen their capacity for peacekeeping and has trained over 250,000 peacekeepers in Africa. It has provided guidance on security sector reform and on countering violent extremism. It has also been engaged in supporting peace processes, for example, in Cameroon, in Central African Republic, and South Sudan. So it has a formidable presence for resourcing peace and security in Africa. We will most probably see this continued support here, especially because of the growing threat of ISIS. But the form of support must speak to the needs of African citizens. So assist with the evaluation of the implementation of the plans to silence the guns and the various country level strategies for countering violent extremism. These must be revisited so that they are more context appropriate. Revisit the plan and then develop strategies accordingly that are more context specific. Providing us with high-tech military weapons and setting up military bases may leave us with bigger problems than violent extremism in years to come, as we already see the remilitarization in many of our societies. Security sector reform remains for us a key concern. And again, we saw this with the response to COVID-19 and the brutality of our security sector. GERD is a big challenge for the Horn of Africa, and here America tended to side with Egypt. We need resolution on the GERD so that this can go forward. We need the support for the peace processes in South Sudan and in Sudan itself, so that that transition to civilian government can occur smoothly. AGOA needs to be renegotiated, and they tell us it takes about 5 years to do so. The implementation of AGOA must be evaluated to see in which ways it has benefited Africa and the US. A renegotiated AGOA and the AFCTA must be in harmony. They must be able to speak to each other. So it would be wise if America engages with the Secretariat of the AFCTA and UNECA and other stakeholders to ensure that appropriate agreement emerges in 2025. And this is a point that Professor Konage has been stressing. African Americans in particular need to be at the forefront of ensuring that American foreign policy does not sow further division in Africa, on, for example, the Western Sahara, or by bypassing the AU and REX. Ensure that the representatives to the African Union and to key African countries are people who also believe in the African agenda, so that there is mutual respect and benefit as we regrow these relations. Assist us to strengthen our multilateral institutions, not bypass them for America's strategic advantage. This year, the African Union has dedicated to arts, culture, and heritage. And here too, African Americans can play an important role in supporting the arts and promoting heritage as a focus for development. Help us grow the cultural economy. I just came earlier today from celebrating the Battle of Adwa, a battle in Ethiopia that gave rise to Pan-Africanism and influenced how Black people regain their dignity, pride, and self-reliance. Yet so few know about this. How do we promote the celebration of these kinds of events? And I think here also African Americans and other Africans in the diaspora, we need to rethink the celebrations and the marking of these kinds of events. Not all countries, a lot of countries are now developing these forums to engage Africa. So we have a sort of FOCAC and Japan and Russia. How can America create a forum, but one that does not replicate or compete with these other forums? And here I think it should be one that's not state to state, but people to people kinds of annual forums, because these kinds of exchanges would then form deeper bonds between us. Obviously, health remains key, and we need to continue with support for AIDS and TB and Ebola, and now also so that Africa can gain access to vaccines, but also importantly, to help us to build that health infrastructure, to help us also to build the educational infrastructure that is needed. GBV remains a scourge in Africa. We need more holistic interventions for dealing with this. We are only now beginning to collate the data so that we can understand the extent of the problem, but we still need to introduce the necessary measures and programs to deal sufficiently with this. And I think here also the US can start by assisting, especially our security sector, to establish things like sexual misconduct centers. For our security sector are part of the problem and not the solution to it. I also do like the emphasis on LGBTQI. It's a huge challenge across this continent. And a lot of support would be welcome there. So by way of conclusion, listen to Africa, its needs and what and how it was done, hold the necessary dialogue, support the right people to represent you here, and deepen the people to people as well as the state-to-state relations. Think anew, think innovatively, and think collaboratively. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor Hendricks. So we're going to now open the meeting for questions. One of our speakers was not able to get on because he had internet connection. Before we did that, I'm going to ask Professor Zongola if he wants to say a few words.
Yeah.
Okay.
I'd like to congratulate all the speakers for wonderful presentations. There were many common themes, but I think the most important, which was the first pronounced by Sister Walker, but also found in other presentations, is the whole issue of the United States participation in undermining democracy in Africa. Many of the problems we're having on the continent today are due to this process of, for example, I think Cheryl just referred to that we want to promote this union government, this unity government and reconciliations and so on. So we're getting thieves and thugs and the criminals into governments, all that so we can have peace. But what does that do? It undermines the whole belief that people have in democracy. It weakens the state. It weakens our armed forces. I'll give you an example of the Congo, my country, the DRC. Every time we had the rebellion in the East, which were rebellions, but were provoked or even organized by neighboring countries like Rwanda and Uganda. For example, we had this group called the M23, and the M23 was made up of militia groups, basically Ugandan and Rwandan. And then we had our government send our foreign minister to negotiate with them and give them permission to organize a political party in the Congo and to integrate them into the armed forces of the DRC. And then when one of their main leader was arrested, gave himself to the American embassy in Kigali and was sent to the International Criminal Court, he went there and said that the only language he's really fluent in, he can really defend himself in very well, is Kinyarwanda. And later on turned out that he was a Rwandan citizen and not a Congolese. So we've had our army infiltrated by foreigners. And that does not create for a stable defense force, does not create for an army, but is capable of maintaining peace and security. So the US and the European allies have been undermining democracy in Africa by this search for peace and security, by including people of different ideologies, different views together. That is simply not the solution. Angola took the right position when it refused to negotiate with UNITA, to say that we are not into the business of going into this kind of talk. And so this is the solution which is not viable to us at all. The other thing is the whole question of corruption. We know about, I think the first speaker spoke about the army officers in Kenya who are benefiting from trafficking in arms and trafficking in other things of the Shabab and so on. This is very well known. This is one of the main reasons why in the Congo, our army is incapable of stopping these militia groups. And of course, today, we know that we have 122 militia groups, according to the latest report by the two organizations doing research in Eastern Congo. 122 militia groups from the Ituri province in the northeast all the way to Katanga in the southeast. And who are these militia groups? Most of them, of course, are Congolese, but there are also many who are from neighboring countries, from South Sudan, from Uganda, from Rwanda, from Burundi. And yet, our government is incapable, and we have the United Nations, and somebody spoke about the UN. We have the United Nations, but have 17,000 troops. They have a total population of over 20,000 representatives, but 17,000 are troops. And then we have among them the SADC Intervention Brigade, which SADC set up to help the Congo and these militia groups. And that the United Nations insisted that this brigade be integrated in MONUSCO, the United Nations force in the Congo. What happened? The SADC brigade succeeded in getting rid of the M23. But then since then, nothing has been done because they have simply not been allowed by the United Nations to be independent and to operate the way SADC wanted to operate. So we need to stop depending on these foreign powers, and United States, and United Nations, and France. We've got to have our own forces, which are well trained and well equipped, but with governments that are democratic and that respect the human rights of all people.
Thank you, Professor Sonko. There are a couple of questions in the chat box, so I'll start with reading a couple of them, and then I'll open it up, and you can unmute yourself to ask your question. The first question is for Dr. Al-Bulushi from Danava. Could you please discuss the alternatives to the militarization in Africa in the fight against terrorism, and how to reconcile the need to promote democracy in Africa with the need to support authoritarian military government that are fighting terrorism?
Thank you for that question. I think that, oh, sorry, let me turn my video back on. All right. So I have a few thoughts on this, and I think they'll echo much of what has been articulated in different ways by some of the other speakers, especially Professor Cheryl Hendricks, and the point she made about the fact that if violent extremism is spreading on the continent today, then we need to question the methods that have been used supposedly to address it. And I would argue that there is a direct correlation between the rise in militant activity and violence and the onset of AFRICOM and the onset of the war on terror. We can see it very, very clearly in the case of East Africa, where Al-Shabaab is the product of military intervention. While there were some militant, a very small number of militant factions within the Islamic Courts Union in Somalia at the time, they only grew in the wake of the Ethiopian intervention. And all of the attacks that have taken place in Kenya, the sizable attacks, with the exception of the bombings of 1998, of course, have occurred since the Kenyan military invaded in Somalia. So we absolutely need to question the methods that have been deployed. Secondly, I have no illusion that if we were to dismantle the formal structure of AFRICOM today, that very much would change. And this is very important because if we think of militarism as the only problem, then we're actually deluding ourselves. If we think of outright military violence as the only problem, then we're deluding ourselves, because what actually sustains the US imperial formation are the relationships that are built between the US military and African militaries, often in the form of civilian exchanges, right? So the trainings, the police to police trainings, the military to military trainings, even if they are in the name of security sector reform, in the name of transparency, in the name of the rule of law, the point is they're building relationships that can then be called upon if and when the United States needs something, right? So that's number one, that we cannot focus exclusively on the kind of formal dimensions of militarization. We need to think about practically what this looks like and what is enabled even through diplomatic channels, right? Secondly, if we were to put the military entirely aside and look at the donor industrial complex, look at the State Department, look at USAID, then we would see that even the realm of civil society is changing with the rise of the war on terror and the discourse of violent extremism, such that it is becoming much harder for people to have conversations, for people to have debate about what democracy even should look like, right? So putting aside it as a term that supposedly we all are committed to, what does it actually look like in practice? And something that we haven't yet discussed today is the extent to which surveillance permeates so much of civil society spaces. It permeates mosques to the point that people cannot freely think through what is happening, right? And the effect of that then is that we might instead see kind of violent outbursts, right? Because there's very little room in between to have actual conversations. And, you know, activists on the ground are paying a direct price for the rise in surveillance, right? Many people who are questioning the militarization that is taking place, who are questioning the policing, who are questioning the disappearances and the extrajudicial killings, themselves disappear, are arrested, and we in the United States have a role to play in following what's happening to activists on the ground and to building solidarity with them. And I know there is a question about that that I'm also happy to address either now or later.
You get to some other questions, maybe we can come back to that. There's a question, it appears from Judith Baker, it appears to be, I guess, addressed to the panel in general. It says that these questions are very high priority. Where are the conversations going on aimed at helping us to know what to advocate for? So I'm not sure who would like to take that one on. I'm not sure who that was addressed to.
So I can partially, this is Marcel.
Yes, go ahead.
I can partially address that question by building on the answer of the previous speaker. That says we should advocate for African voice. What I mean by that is that when you take a conflict or threat is defined not from African's point of view, but from Western countries' point of view. And the solution to address those threats are also defined outside of Africa. If Africans don't own the response, first the perception and the response to threat to security and stability, those solutions brought from outside to solve Africans' problems will not be efficient. So first thing, listen to Africans and listen to their needs. I was reading a report about elections in Uganda this morning. The report is saying that Museveni had killed more people than Obote, Idi Amin, and Tito Okello together. But the Uganda government has intervened in helping rebels in South Sudan, has intervened in Rwanda and Congo. So he serves the interests of outside powers. And right now, Uganda has a guard in Iraq serving under the US command. So when Uganda is providing those services to Western powers, then he has been given the freedom to do anything he wants in his own country, including jailing his opponent during the elections, killing and jailing the supporter of his opponent. And that is also create reason incentive for opposition to get stronger and further lead to political instability in the country, while providing services to outside powers that have nothing to do with Africans' needs. So first, listen to Africans. That will be my answer.
Thank you. This is a question from Rob Prince. Is there any serious momentum towards the creation of a regional authority to resolve the conflicts over the Nile River, especially as it concerns the near completion of the Grand Ethiopian Renaissance Dam?
If I may come in on a few of the others as well very quickly before I get to that. The first is, as I also tried to stress, the Africans have an agenda. That agenda needs to be at the forefront also when America engages us. America has its agenda. It is very clear that it wants to deal with peace and security, democracy, governance, economic growth, trade, and investment. And for us, those areas, good and well, but it is the how you are going to engage us that we have been emphasizing here. Secondly, around if it's not militarization, what is it? We are not saying that we don't need security. The security apparatus needs to be there, provided for citizens, but these are our sons and daughters, so we cannot go and simply wipe them out or chase them somewhere else. We have to engage them in dialogue to find a sustainable solution to the rising violent extremism. And the solution here is not necessarily about including them in governments, but the kind of governance that has been taking place, and how do we then transform it so that everybody feels included, everybody feels secure, and everybody feels that they can prosper in the states that we have. The third intervention, there was a question prior to that about how do we build people's power and awareness across national borders and sentiments. And here it's not how do we build people's power, because people's power is there. It's about how do we harness people's power effectively to deal with these particular issues. And here I think we must look to our recent past, to movements like the Black Lives Matter movement, decolonization of knowledge, how they organized, how they used technology, how they shared messages, how they were non-hierarchical in their formations, and see how we can then utilize that in order to get these messages across. And in then relation to good, I don't think that another regional organization needs to be created to deal with good. We have the African Union, we have IGAD, they have been engaging on this. It is for these negotiations to again commence. And it is really about defining what does equitable access and appropriate use of the Nile River mean, and forging then new agreements, because of the 11 states of that particular Nile Basin, I think only 8 states signed the 2010 CFA agreement. Egypt was not one of them, and hence some of those challenges, because they're not agreeing on basic principles of sharing. And so we need to go right back to square one again and get a new agreement signed, and then come back to a negotiation table here. Thank you.
Okay, thank you for that. There's a question from Kerry McLean to Professor Al-Bulushi. What are the opportunities for solidarity between African Americans and Africans in the struggle against police violence and militarization?
Thank you for that question. I think the opportunities are so many, and we already see a very, I think, encouraging examples of solidarity just in the last several months. Most recently, I'm sure some of you followed the protests that were taking place in Nigeria against police abuses there. And there were conversations set up online between activists in the United States and in Nigeria to learn more from each other about how different people are resisting. Similarly, there was a conversation on Zoom with activists in Uganda recently in the context of the elections and people trying to think through the long history of abuse of power by the Museveni regime. So I find that to be very, very encouraging, especially because there has been a tendency in activist circles to almost kind of do a contrast where we focus on policing at home in the United States and warfare abroad. And I think we need to be similarly looking at policing, abuse along the lines of police all over the world and not have such a stark contrast between spaces of war and peace, right? Because the reality of this world is one in which those boundaries are fluid and constantly evolving. I also wanted to specifically kind of get at, encourage us to think about US university campuses and the ways in which we are entangled in many of these dynamics. I'll give you a concrete example. President Paul Kagame came to Yale University to give a speech when I was there doing my doctoral research. And Kagame brought with him a whole slew of security officials to Yale's campus. And there was a protest organized on that campus that I participated in against his presence at Yale and the fact that Yale was providing him with a platform in light of his role in so much violence. Yale University permitted his security officials to circle around us and to photograph and film us. They were effectively surveilling us, right? And so we need to be posing questions to our universities, to our university administrators, not only about the fact that they provide a platform for individuals like Kagame, but about the fact that they then permit an outside government to be surveilling us on our own campuses, right? And of course, this is all only possible because of the very close relationship between the Rwandan government and the US government, right? None of this would be happening without that. But that's a very concrete, like close to home form of activism that we can be thinking about and making connections between forms of surveillance and policing here in the United States and in Africa. Thanks.
Okay, thank you. Does anyone have a question? I mean, you can raise your hand using the thing there, or we'll try to see.
Professor Roy Campbell?
Yes, Julialynne, go ahead.
Yes. First, I hope that people would take away, in part from my discussion, an understanding that what's happening in the United States should be viewed as an international issue and not a local issue. That is a human rights issue and not a civil rights issue. And if we can just begin to have conversations at that level and really engage our communities to understand that the United States cannot penalize other countries for what's happening internally and not apply the same standards to itself and not address that. And so there's a very parochial understanding within the US and a reluctance to actually use the international tools that are available. So it compounds the error. So we could just begin to move into this space and say, no, this really is an international issue, and we have allies around the world who need to be brought into this conversation. That's number one. And number two, and the most, some of the recent phenomenon has been, as I referenced, the Black Lives Matter movement. If we remember with George Floyd, there were demonstrations around the world. There were millions of people took to the streets to support us. And we really have to be able to engage that energy and not see it as a once-off, but actually then say, well, then fine, thank you. Then what do we do to understand your struggle, and what do we do to support your struggle? And we had, I remember schoolgirls in South Africa. I think it was Parktown High, just on the question of hair and being able to wear an afro in 2019 or 2020. You had issues of young African women being told they could not wear their hair natural as high school students. And so, you know, there are clearly a lot of contradictions that exist within our societies. So no one area is perfect and needs to be addressed. And then finally, yes, there is the African Union. And within that, and I didn't have a discussion, you know, and certainly we can do that at some point, but really a discussion of the sixth region and representation from the diaspora within the AU. And what does that look like? And, you know, of course, very quickly, we can come up with at least 20, 25 different categories of the kinds of people who would need to be accommodated, because it's not a simple matter of simply saying there's a sixth region and that's for the diaspora. And certainly there's a lot of self-interest within many African governments as to, you know, who should be considered the diaspora and what that should mean. And so there are areas of engagement that really begin with self-education and then interacting with people who are, you know, already in the arena, you know, pursuing these issues and attempting to achieve change, you know, on them. So I'll stop there.
Thank you. Did you want to say something, George?
Yeah. Somebody raised the question of how do we advocate for Africa and what do we do? We don't have Trans-Africa anymore, but we have so many other organizations. And I think that the Congressional Black Caucus is a very important organization. I lived in Washington. I was taught at Howard University for 19 years. And when Trans-Africa was created, I worked with them. And I was in touch with a number of members of the caucus. They were very, very eager to be educated in Africa because what they get from the government, for example, I met with one member during our fight against Mobutu in the Congo. And he told me, the professor, you know, the CIA is telling us that there is really no difference between Mobutu and Tshisekedi. So I said, well, sir, you are being misinformed. You are being lied to because there is a great difference between Tshisekedi and Mobutu. So I think that we can do a very good job in terms of being in touch with these organizations where you have people who have really clout, like Congressman Clyburn from South Carolina, and who can talk to the president to try to see if they can influence Africa policy. We also have Linda Thomas Greenfield, with whom I went to school with. You know, she was a couple years behind me in a PhD program at University of Wisconsin-Madison in political science. She's a wonderful person and a very good listener. Is someone that we could engage with by talking to in terms of seeing, and of course, she's also not only ambassador to the UN, she's a member of the cabinet. So she'll be sitting on weekly cabinet meetings at the White House. So she might have a way to try to see what she can do in terms of influencing US policy on Africa. So we should take advantage of all of these opportunities to see in what way we can make a difference. I don't think it will be a great difference, but at least where we can make a few changes here and there, we should attempt to take opportunity and do that. Thank you.
Thank you.
Can I add to what Professor Songola said?
Yes, go ahead.
So I was mentioning the Advocacy Network for Africa in Washington, DC, because no one person can really influence US policy, not one single organization. So when I was living in Washington, DC, we formed a coalition of 50 different NGOs. And we all lobby the Congress and the administration on African issues. And we come together, we discuss the most important issues, and then we divide the labor, even we ask people in different states to lobby their respective congressmen and women for such and such policy. And then it is where the most important issues emerge. Kimberley, a Blood Diamond issue, Darfur issue, Save Darfur campaign, all those things emerge from those this particular coalition. And then if that coalition doesn't exist, I don't live in Washington, DC anymore. If it doesn't exist, you have to revive such coalition. And the Biden-Harris administration has created an opportunity for such a public advocacy on behalf of Africa and people of African descent.
Any of the other speakers wanted to respond to any of those questions? Did you have a question, Madi?
Yes, if anyone else doesn't have a question, I do have a question. Well, my first question is for Dr. Kittisou and Dr. Bulushi. In terms of militarization in the Sahel and in the West, in the East, how does AFRICOM, phasing out AFRICOM, how will that look like? How does, like my question in terms of peacekeeping missions, what if the AU is doing them versus AFRICOM, like what are the contrasting differences? And like, how do we get to start thinking about if we want AFRICOM out today, like what are the first steps we would take? And then I have a second question, like technically to all speakers, but Julialynne, you mentioned areas of engagement that we haven't yet really engaged with. And I was thinking in terms of immigration, what are your thoughts? Because not only are our states exporting human capital like labor, but also militarization, right? Like we have Sudanese people fighting in the UAE. I just heard about the Ugandan people fighting in other parts. So how does immigration fit into this issue and how much of a priority is it in terms of an issue we need to be engaging? Thank you.
Okay. There's a question about the ceasefire in Libya. Does anyone want to talk about?
I haven't followed that situation lately very closely, so I do not want to comment on it until I have more information. But as for Sahel, in general, we rely on states to solve the conflict without realizing that most of the time the state themselves are source of instability. So, and that is one of the problems. If the states are not concerned about the needs of their own people, then there will be political instability. It is a trilogy described by Christian Parenti, Tropic of Chaos. The trilogy: poverty, harsh climate, combined provoke political instability. And if states fail to meet the needs of their constituents, their citizens, often that end up in political instability, as when weapons are available, people take weapons. So that is my first answer. My second answer, that we will take the case of the formation of a G5 joint force. First, they asked for, just for the sake of argument, they asked for $800 billion to start. And then Europeans protested, and then they cut it in half. So they are taking advantage of that structure to enrich themselves rather than addressing the real problem in the region. So I read the statistics very lately that when you ask jihadis why they are fighting, 50% will say because of religion. 75% will say because of the actions of the state. So I will stop there for now.
Okay. Did someone else want to respond to that? The U.S. position? Madi, you want to say something? I see your hand. Or you said accidentally? I see your hand up. Okay. Judith, you have a question about Darfur. Do you want to ask your question?
Thank you. Yes, I mean, many of us in the United States and elsewhere have been involved for our whole lives in one or another attempt to support African liberation struggles, the AIDS response, education, and we've always had organizations. Now we still have a Darfur organization, which I belong to, which is trying very hard to support the Sudanese non-military, effort, but we're very small now, and we don't have an anti-apartheid successor to work with our colleagues in South Africa. We have global health allies. We're working very, very hard on the COVID and other health response. But I'm just wondering, where is it that it's going to come from, this effort, that we can figure out, which government do we support? Which one do we leave alone because we can't fight them? Which people's organization should we raise money for? It's very hard right now to figure out what to do. And I think that discussion is something that I would love to participate in, but I don't even know where to find it.
Like to address that?
Okay, so I can talk about my own experiences. When I was in DC, I was executive director of Africa Faith and Justice Network, which was under the Catholic Bishop Conference. So we took that opportunity to create within the Catholic Bishop Conference Africa task force. And the first thing to do is to fight against the bishops themselves so that they accept the use of condom as a way for health reasons, so that to help stop the spread of HIV/AIDS. So it is essential that you build personal connections first, and then from personal connection with the coalition, and I will say to transform a moment into a movement. And it takes time, but you have to build those connections. I also used to go as representative of AFJN to go to the Congress and talk to the staff of congressmen and women and staff of senators to explain what my analysis of the situation is, and then they convey that into their bosses and transform that into resolution or policy.
Okay, thank you. Anyone else want to respond to that?
I was going to address Monty's question earlier in terms of migration, immigration, and have us reflect on the continuation again of the colonial borders. We're still going back to the Berlin Conference. And some of us who are of a certain age remember that for many decades, the only way to get from one African country to another was to go back to Europe. And so right now, as Cheryl Hendricks mentioned earlier, the Agenda 2063, and a key part of that is One Africa, and it is about, a part of that is having a Pan-African passport. And there have been various instances in the past where there have been regional blocs, ECOWAS, the East African Community, when 2, 3, 4 countries came together and agreed on the elimination or the simplification of visa restrictions, requirements between countries to increase the flow of people. And so when you see it happening in Europe, and then you say Africa can't do it, you have to ask yourself why. What is the difference? And when questions of smuggling and uncontrolled migration and criminal element moving, you still have to say, well, why is that an issue for Africa and it's not an issue for Europe? And so it's important for us to recognize that there are a handful of countries currently that have made significant efforts either to have no visa requirement for other African countries, or very simplified visa requirements, or issuing a visa upon arrival at the point of entry. So there are efforts being made to encourage that inter-regional interaction. I know that it's very interesting right now with South Africa, when there was a lot of, there was a strong dependence on international tourism. You remember there was a big thing with the safaris and bringing folks in from around the world. And with COVID, and then the relaxation, and then the reopening of the borders, currently the largest segment of tourism is from within Africa and within South Africa itself. So there's a promotion of the country internal tourism as well as intra-regional tourism, so that people are actually getting to know the country and the region for themselves. And so, yes, there's the Agenda 2063 that promotes at a high level this one Africa. The reality of doing it is really a country by country and a region by region context. And I'll stop there.
Okay, thank you. We're coming to the end. We have about 5 minutes left. So what I'm going to do now, I'm going to turn it over to Professor.
There was a question here. Samar said she was going to answer.
Which was that?
Samar was going to.
Okay, go ahead. Sorry, I didn't see that. Okay, go ahead.
I'll be brief. I just wanted, because they were excellent questions posed by, is it Mahdi? Is that how you pronounce your name? Okay. And one of them, I think I can build a bit on the response that was just given by Julian Walker on migration, but specifically what I heard you to be asking about was migrant military labor. That is the term that is used now to refer to people who migrate, right, to fight in foreign wars. So we're talking about Ugandans in Iraq, we're talking about Sudanese in Yemen, and we're talking about a whole range, 5 or 6 different African countries that are sending troops to fight in Somalia, right? And this reflects a very, very troubling reality that African economies are increasingly reliant on war, right? And that is facilitated by US empire, right? If any one of these economies were more stable and ever able to pay people better incomes, there simply would not be a need to travel for the purpose of war. Regarding your question about the African Union and peacekeeping missions as a potential replacement or alternative to AFRICOM, this raises all kinds of questions that extend back to the early days of independence, when Kwame Nkrumah was pushing for a continental-wide African army, when he was pushing for a continental-wide financial currency for the purposes of financial autonomy. And Gaddafi tried to resuscitate those ideas in the 1990s, anticipating the emergence of AFRICOM, and we saw what happened to him, right? So number one, we have to acknowledge what happens to dangerous ideas, right? And the people who put them forward. And number two, we then have to deal with a very practical dimension of what is possible within those constraints, right? And the African Union mission in Somalia is technically an independent entity, right? Technically speaking, it is not a part of AFRICOM. African Union itself is technically an independent entity, but it relies so much on finances from the outside. So these are things that we have to begin to address in order to be able to envision a more autonomous future. Thanks.
Thank you. Thank you, Samar. I'm going to turn it over to Professor Campbell to close out. Any final remarks he might want to say, because we're coming to the end of our time. I'd like to thank all the contributors, presenters, as well as the questions. So, Professor Campbell.
Okay. I want to, on behalf of the Africa Initiative, thank all of those who turned up on this Saturday afternoon to participate in this discussion on the Biden-Harris administration and Africa. I thank you for your questions and participation. And I want to thank the presenters. I was very moved by the clarity of their ideas about strengthening the relations between the peoples of the United States and peoples of Africa. I hope that for some of you who have had this written out, you can send it to us and share it, and we can find ways of putting it up next to the recording of this, which I'm sure is being recorded. I want to thank you for doing this and thank Zongola for stepping in. Our speaker, the Deputy Chairperson of the African Union, he was on the phone with me throughout because he was asking me, was there any way he could record and upload it now? Because he is in Addis Ababa and the electricity went out and internet went out, and without internet, he could not participate. So he was asking me if there was another time where he could interact with the panel. And I think we will have to find some way of doing this. So I want to apologize on his behalf. And Kerry told me that I can pass on his information to you because I told him that you were going to come here to be able to speak to him. So, hello? Hello, can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you, Malima.
Go
Yes.
ahead. Somebody
Yes.
needs to mute. I don't know who's on mute.
Yes, I am. I'm really, really very grateful. There are one or two points that I want to highlight, and I think the first major point that I want to highlight is the question of demilitarization that was spoken to by all the presenters, and the relationship between demilitarization at home and abroad. And Julialynne brought that out very clearly to say that we have to internationalize the question of police violence and militarism and make it one question. And Dada Samar, she explicated on this. Zongola talked about this, and Marcel and Cheryl. Cheryl has been working on this, whether she was working with this in the context of Pedestria or as the head of department at the University of Johannesburg, or as in our own new position as the head of the Africa Institute in South Africa. And Cheryl, I do not think that the fact that we recently had a South African as the head of the African Union should prevent us from promoting your candidacy for the position as the chairperson of the African Union, because the position you're articulating is so very clear for all of us on what Africa needs to do and to challenge this idea of reset. You know, I'm so happy that this discussion of reset was addressed by all the speakers, because Karen Bass, who is the chairperson of the subcommittee of the House Committee on Africa from California, she gave a presentation to the Wilson, to the Woodrow Wilson Center, and she used a formulation reset. But everything about her reset was to go back to the way Obama was doing things, without any critique of what the United States did before to support militarization in Africa. So we know that Greg Meeks is now the chair of the Foreign Relations Committee in the Congress. So the points that were being made about African voices and listening to African voices were just so much on point. We have some people from Colorado on this call who are very interested in the question of GERD, the Grand Ethiopian Renaissance Dam. And the points that were made on the Grand Renaissance Dam about sharing and cooperation is so central to how we go forward. But there's a point that I wanted to elaborate on that was made by Samar Al-Bulushi about the university as a space for the relations between the United States and Africa. I'm speaking from where we are at Syracuse University. The university as a space seeks to marginalize Africans and progressive Africans when it comes to questions of Africa. For example, in the United States of America, they have something in the Obama administration called YALI, Young African Leadership Initiative. And they take about 25 students to 20 campuses. And one of the campuses they take the students to is Syracuse University campus. But when they come to Syracuse University campus, the State Department and their handlers in the university make sure those people are not associated with Africa Initiative. They think the ideas from Africa Initiative would infect the people who come from Africa. So we should be saying to Karen Bass and Greg Meeks that you should not be perpetuating this white supremacy idea that people who are brought from Africa to United States campuses should internalize white supremacy ideas about what happens on university campus. So the whole research agenda on African campuses in this country, in the African Studies establishment, supports the kind of destruction and destabilization that we have in Africa. And part of the reason that we want to have forums like these with very limited resources, and this is why I want to be so thankful for all of the speakers, because they came because of their commitment to Africa. They came not because we could command large sums of money to pay them. They were committing themselves to an idea about how to strengthen intellectual exchanges. And I think if one thing that can come out of our discussion is to pressure people like Karen Bass and Greg Meeks and the Congressional Black Caucus not to continue the policies of marginalized Africans and supporting Israel. Cheryl made this point very quickly, but I wanted to stress on this point that was made by Cheryl. The Moroccan government brought the Congressional Black Caucus to Morocco to undermine the position of the African Union on the Western Sahara and the Polisario. So that Black political leaders in the United States are being seduced by the Israeli and the APAC lobby in the United States of America, and they're also very active on the campus. So I wanted to say that I am so pleased for the work that has been done, and I want to thank the speakers again, and please look out for how we can collaborate in the future. And I think that I said enough. I said enough. The point is made about the African voice and African voices and listen to Africa. I think we all agree with that. But we want to listen to progressive African voices. So thank you very much. I think we can now hand it over to Mahi.
Thank you.
Thank you, Malimu. Well, I want to thank everybody. I think this was a great discussion. Jordan and I have been communicating with the speakers. So I really do want to thank you, as Malimu said, like for offering your time and being gracious with your knowledge. I think for me personally, it was a great start because I've been like dying to have this conversation about what this new administration means to Africa. So I'm very honored to be a part of one of the first starting conversations, and I look forward to many things. And Africa Initiative has a few other events planned this semester, but I'll send out an email to all speakers and even our audience. Do reach out to us if you want to keep engaged conversations like this going, because that is where I think right now in our space in the university, this is a good space to start these conversations and have more people involved. And yeah, so thank you once again, everybody, for having us. And I also want to thank Jordan, who's been working with me in this. So Dr. McKinney, back to you if you want to close us out.
Well, again, thank everyone for joining us, presenters, the audience, and stay tuned.
Okay, bye-bye.
Okay, thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye, thank you.
Take care.
Hi, Ms. Baker. Why don't you drop your email